Overall, society has taught us that our periods is something that we shouldn't be talking about, that it is something that is kept to ourselves, that we should be hiding our menstrual products while we are in public, that it is something that is icky, that is gross, that overall we really shouldn't be talking about. And that is something that many of us have internalized, that we don't want to talk about our periods. We normalize the fact that our period pain can be debilitating when that is common, but it's definitely not normal. And I think it is primarily because it's something that we're not talking about. Many of us opt for not even wanting to see our period blood, opting for things that are internal, like tampons or menstrual cups, menstrual discs. That way, we don't have to deal with the sight of blood, or opting to not see them in general with a hormonal birth control method. And that isn't even going into the conversation of periods being portrayed as something just for reproduction. So, for those individuals like myself that don't want to have kids, that could have a complicated relationship with our period as well as just being a cycling being in general. But have you ever stopped to consider why some of our periods, for those of us that experience our periods, change from one cycle to the next? Why some cycles are longer or shorter than others? How sometimes the color can change, and what that can actually indicate with our overall health. So it turns out that our periods can actually tell us a lot of information about our overall cycle and our hormonal health. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 key areas that you can see in your period and give you a couple of different insights into why things can vary from one cycle to the next. So the first one I want to talk about is timing. So one full cycle is from one period to the next. That is one full cycle. And there's actually no such thing as a late period. And that's because it isn't so much that the period is delayed, it's actually that the follicular phase, if you remember back to our anatomy physiology, that we have 4 distinct phases. We have our period, our menstruation, our follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. Now, what happens when our period is quote unquote delayed is that the follicular phase gets extended. And the reason for that is that our body is trying to ovulate in cases where we are chronically stressed, we are undernourished, we have some type of hormonal imbalance going on. It takes longer for our body to ovulate. What that means is that we spend more time in our follicular phase. And what's important to note here when it comes to timing is that if it's taking longer for us to ovulate, that means that we're taking longer to enter the luteal phase, because without ovulation, it being one of the main phases, without ovulation, we can't enter the luteal phase. So if you're noticing that your periods are becoming longer in between, that means that your cycles are becoming longer. That could mean that you're spending more time in the follicular phase, which is the phase of our cycle that we're producing estrogen. That is something to note in case of a hormonal imbalance where estrogen can be the dominant hormone. The next part of our period that we can keep track of is the flow. Is it heavy? Is it light? Is there a lot of spotting? What we can determine with our flow is how the uterine lining was built in the previous cycle. So here we have a diagram, and it shows that during the follicular phase, so that first half of the cycle, our endometrial lining is being built up. And then in the luteal phase, it then comes with more vasculature or more blood flow to the endometrial lining. So first half of the cycle is being built up. Second half of the cycle, it is getting blood flow. Now knowing these 2 things, we can then talk about what our flow would look like. So if you're having a pretty heavy, pretty painful period, that can give us an indication that during the previous cycle, the endometrial lining was built a little bit too much. The phase of our cycle where it's being built up is the follicular phase. So it was being built a little bit too much, which then led to a heavier flow, which once again indicates that we're spending a little bit more time in the follicular phase, which is our estrogen producing phase. And then if it's a lighter flow, that can give us a couple of different indications. So this overall means that there is a dysregulation between estrogen and progesterone. They're not having the equal parts to them. It's able to be built up the uterine lining and then get the vasculature. There is some dysregulation in those hormones. And then the question comes up, what exactly is it to be a heavy flow versus a lighter flow? And that will overall vary person to person. So what I want you to think about is, what is heavy for you? So based on the cycles that you've had. So if you've been keeping track of your periods, if not, it's a good thing to start keeping track of your periods. How many pads do you use on your heaviest day? How many tampons do you use on the heaviest day? And see where it engages with what is normal for you in your body. But an ideal length for our period is about 3 to 7 days, including spotting. You don't want it to be less than 2 days because that is definitely too light and that isn't enough time for the intermittent lining to be shed effectively, which means that it wasn't very much built up in the previous cycle. And you also don't want it to be too heavy and going past day 7 because that is a little bit too much hard on our body to be losing that amount of blood, and that can lead to things like anemia and undernourishment, which can then continue the cycle of a hormonal imbalance. And then the last thing that we can look at is the color. So, what is the color of your period, and is it the same every single period? Because if you haven't noticed, your period blood can indeed change colors. It can go from a ruby red to a more pinkish tone to purplish to a more dark brown color. That is what's in the norm of more normal. Well, then, if we have any type of infection or something else going on, we can see shades of gray, orange, or even black sometimes. So it's good to keep track of what color your period blood is. Now, some of the colors to note is if it takes on more of a pinkish tone, you'll see it as maybe like a hot pink color. That can be an indication of low estrogen. While if it's taking on more of a color of a purpley tone, so think of like maybe like a blueberry color, then that can be an indication of high estrogen to progesterone. And then what brown blood means is that it is considered oxidated blood or old blood. So it could be blood from the previous cycle. If you're first starting your period and you notice that you start off with brown blood, that is technically blood from the previous cycle. That means that the uterine lining isn't being able to shed effectively. Or if you're getting more spotting at the end of your cycle, at the end of your period, then that can be indication that it could be normal for you or that it's taking a longer time for the uterus to be able to contract, because what the cramps that we're feeling is the contraction of our uterus to be able to shed lining. So if there is more spotting, then that could be that the uterus overall is a little bit on the weaker side and it's having a hard time doing those muscle contractions. So these are a couple of things that you can start looking into when it comes to your period health, your cycle health overall. So next time you get your period, see what color it is, how the flow is, and how long ago you had your previous period to see the cycle length, more or less, how long that was. If you want to dive even deeper in understanding your cycle health, especially your hormonal health, if you are struggling with a hormonal imbalance, then I do highly recommend learning how to track your cycle in detail. And there is a couple of ways you can do that. I'll have a couple of book recommendations and podcast recommendations down in the description. I also have a how to track your cycle masterclass where it gives you a crash course on how to map out your cycle on a day-to-day basis. All right, that's all for me today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I'll be seeing you next time.